My husband lost my $40,000 savings in illegal poker games and then demanded more money from me to pay his debts. When I refused, he went crazy, pulled me by my hair, tied me to a chair, and threw salty water on me before leaving me alone. I was scared, but I knew I couldn't let him win. The next day, I made a plan. He had no idea what was coming, but I was ready to give him the shock of his life. My name is Isabella Grant, and I never imagined my life would end up the way it did. I'm 32 years old, and I live in Austin, Texas. I'm a teacher, and I have a wonderful son, Ethan, who's 6 now. But there was a time when everything seemed perfect, when I thought I had a future full of love and happiness with my husband, David. I want to share my story with you, not because it's easy to tell, but because I hope it will give others the courage to do what I had to do: survive, protect what matters, and rebuild my life. David and I met in what felt like the most magical of ways. He was charming, thoughtful, and so full of life. He worked as a contractor, and his work ethic was something I admired so much. We dated for about a year, and it didn't take long for me to fall for him completely. He made me feel special, like I was the only person in the world that mattered. We got married not long after, and soon, we welcomed our beautiful son, Ethan, into the world. Life seemed perfect. We had a lovely house, and I thought we were building something wonderful together. I believed we were a family rooted in love and stability. But over time, things started to change. David wasn't the same man I had married. It wasn't obvious at first, but there were small signs, things I tried to overlook. He became more controlling, more dismissive of my feelings. He'd come home from work and make little comments that made me feel small. "Why isn't the house clean?" Or, "What do you even do all day?" His tone was sharp, and no matter how hard I tried to keep everything in order, it was never enough for him. I tried to talk to him about how his words hurt me, but every time, he brushed me off, saying I was being too sensitive or that I didn't understand the pressure he was under. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just stressed from work, I thought. Maybe I needed to try harder. But with each passing day, I felt like I was losing a piece of myself. I no longer felt like an equal partner in our marriage. I felt trapped in my own home. Things only got worse when David's younger brother, Eric, started coming around more often. Eric is 24 and still figuring out his life. He doesn't have a steady job and often relied on David for support. He treated our house like his personal hangout spot, dropping by unannounced, staying for hours and sometimes even days. He'd bring his problems with him, and David would always defend him. Whenever I tried to talk to David about how Eric's presence was making me feel overwhelmed and neglected, he'd shut me down.
"He's family," David would say.
"We need to help him." I felt like I was living in a house where my needs didn't matter. I was constantly taking care of everyone else, but no one was taking care of me. I didn't feel like David's wife anymore. I felt like a servant in my own home, and the love we once shared was disappearing right before my eyes. Then came the day when everything changed. I discovered that David had developed an addiction to gambling, specifically to illegal underground poker games. At first, I didn't know the full extent of it. He would casually mention playing poker with some friends, and I didn't think much of it. But one day, I stumbled across a bank statement that showed a huge withdrawal, $40,000, all gone. That money was supposed to be for Ethan's future, for his education, for our security. I couldn't believe it. I felt sick to my stomach. How could David do this? When I confronted him about it, his reaction was nothing like I expected. He wasn't apologetic. He wasn't remorseful. Instead, he demanded more money. "I need it to pay off the guys I owe," he said, as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. But I knew I couldn't give him more money. I couldn't let him drag us down any further. When I refused, David's anger exploded in a way I had never seen before. That night, he snapped. He tied me to a chair with a rope, his eyes wild with rage. I'll never forget the way he looked at me, like I was the enemy. He grabbed a bucket of water, salty water, and threw it over me. The sting of the salt hitting my skin was nothing compared to the fear that gripped my heart. "Give me the money, Isabella," he shouted over and over. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I was terrified, Not just for myself, but for Ethan. What kind of life was this for him? What kind of father was David becoming? I knew in that moment that I had to find a way out. I had to protect my son, and I had to protect myself. But how? I was tied to a chair, soaked, and powerless. Or so David thought. The fear inside me was strong, but my determination was stronger. I twisted and pulled against the ropes, ignoring the pain, knowing that I had to break free. I had to get out of there. And that's when it happened. The knot loosened, and I slipped one hand free. But that was only the beginning. When I managed to slip my hand free from the rope, my heart raced. Every second felt like a lifetime. I knew David could come back into the room at any moment, and if he saw me trying to escape, I had no idea what he would do. But I couldn't let fear control me anymore. I had to keep going. With my free hand, I loosened the other knot around my wrist and finally freed myself from the chair. I stood up, my legs shaking, but I didn't have time to think about the pain or fear. My mind was focused on one thing: getting Ethan and getting out. I rushed to Ethan's room. My little boy had been hiding, scared and confused, and when I opened the door, his wide, tear-filled eyes looked up at me. "Mommy, what's happening?" he whispered, his small voice trembling. I could barely hold it together, but I knew I had to stay strong for him. "We're leaving, sweetheart," I told him, scooping him into my arms. "We're going to be safe." Everything after that felt like a blur. I grabbed a small bag, tossing in a few clothes for both of us and Ethan's favorite toy, a little stuffed bear he loved. My hands were trembling, and every sound made me think David would burst through the door at any second. I could hear him in the other room, still furious, shouting to himself, but I knew I had a chance to escape before he realized what I was doing. With Ethan in my arms and our small bag of things, I quietly slipped out the back door. The cold night air hit us, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. We had to get to the car and drive. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking from fear and adrenaline. I finally got the door unlocked and buckled Ethan into his seat, his little hands clutching his bear tightly. As I drove away from the house, silence filled the car, but my mind was anything but silent. It was a whirlwind of fear, anger, and the realization that I couldn't go back. Not after what had happened. I knew this was it. I had to leave David for good. If I didn't, something even worse could happen next time. Ethan deserved better, and so did I. I drove to my parents' house, which was about 30 minutes away. Those 30 minutes felt like hours. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, terrified that David would come after us. But we made it. When we finally pulled up to my parents' home, the sight of the familiar house filled me with a small sense of relief. My mother opened the door the moment we arrived, her face full of concern. "Isabella, what happened?" she asked, pulling me into a tight embrace. The warmth of her arms made me crumble. I couldn't hold back the tears any longer. I told her everything about David's gambling, about the money he lost, and finally about how he had tied me up and thrown water on me, demanding more money. My father, who had been pacing in the background, stopped when he heard that last part. I could see the anger in his eyes, but he stayed calm, pulling me and Ethan close. "You're staying here," my father said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "David isn't going to come near you again." I knew I was safe with my parents, but I also knew that wasn't enough. I couldn't just hide from David. I needed to take action to protect Ethan and myself permanently. The next morning, after a night of restless sleep, I woke up with a sense of clarity. I had to get a lawyer, and I had to make sure David never had the chance to hurt us again. So I called Julie Morgan, a lawyer who specialized in family law, and set up a meeting. Julie was kind, but also sharp and no-nonsense. When I told her what had happened, she didn't hesitate. She helped me file for divorce and full custody of Ethan. But I knew that wasn't going to be enough. David's gambling addiction had put us in danger, and I needed evidence to prove it. That's when I made the decision to hire a private investigator. The investigator's job was simple: find out just how deep David was in the illegal poker world. I needed proof, and I needed it fast. Over the next few days, the investigator dug into David's activities. I tried to stay calm, but every hour that passed felt like a lifetime. I kept thinking about what would happen if David realized I was building a case against him. But soon, the investigator came back with exactly what I needed. He had managed to secretly record David cheating during one of his underground poker games. Not only did this prove David was involved in illegal gambling, but it also showed the kind of reckless and dishonest person he had become. This was the evidence I needed. I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. The hardest part was still ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a chance to take control of my life again. The evidence was now in my hands, and it was only a matter of time before David would have to face the consequences of his actions. With the evidence from the private investigator in hand, I felt a glimmer of hope, but I also knew the real battle was just beginning. My lawyer, Julie Morgan, wasted no time in building the case against David. She was sharp, methodical, and knew exactly how to navigate the system to protect me and Ethan. We filed for divorce, full custody of Ethan, and, most importantly, began preparing for the criminal charges David would soon face. The evidence we had was solid. David had not only gambled away $40,000, money meant for our son's future, but he had also cheated at those underground poker games. Julie assured me that this, combined with the documentation of the abuse I had endured, would make for a strong case. But even with all of this on our side, I was still terrified. Facing David in court was something I dreaded. I kept remembering that night. The rope, the salty water, the fear in Ethan's eyes. The thought of seeing David's face again made my stomach turn. In the meantime, the police were involved. With the investigators' recordings, the authorities had everything they needed to charge David with illegal gambling, fraud, and domestic abuse. They moved quickly, and within days, David was arrested. I'll never forget the moment I heard the news. My mother was sitting beside me when the call came in. Hearing the words, "David has been taken into custody," sent a wave of emotions crashing over me. Relief, fear, anger, all at once. I knew this was a step towards safety, but the journey wasn't over yet. The trial date was set, and as it approached, I tried to prepare myself emotionally. I had to keep reminding myself that this was for Ethan. I needed to protect him. My parents were with me every step of the way, and Julie reassured me that we had a solid case. But that didn't make the fear go away. The night before the trial, I barely slept. I kept thinking about everything that had happened. The good times when David and I were happy, and then the slow unraveling of our life together. The day of the trial arrived, and my heart pounded as we walked into the courtroom. I remember holding my breath as I saw David for the first time since the night I escaped. He looked different, more disheveled, but the same cold anger was still there in his eyes. He sat with his lawyer, but I couldn't bring myself to look at him for long. I focused on Julie and what I had to do. Tell the truth. Julie presented our case with precision. She started by outlining David's gambling addiction, the money he lost, and the debts he had accumulated. Then she introduced the recordings, evidence of him cheating at the poker games. The jury listened closely as the details of his illegal activities were laid out before them. But that wasn't all. Julie made sure the court knew about the abuse. She presented photos of the bruises, the reports I had filed with the police, and the account of the night David had tied me to that chair. Hearing it all again, in such a public setting, was difficult. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, but I didn't waver. I knew that this was my chance to stand up for myself and for Ethan. David's lawyer tried to downplay everything. He claimed that David's gambling was just a phase, that he had never intended to hurt me, and that I was exaggerating the abuse. But the evidence was too overwhelming. Every time his lawyer spoke, it felt like they were grasping at straws, trying to shift the blame, but there was no escaping the truth. Finally, it was my turn to testify. My hands shook as I took the stand, but I knew I had to be strong. I spoke about how David had slowly changed, how he had become more controlling, more dismissive of my feelings. I described the fear I felt that night, the way he tied me up and threw salty water over me, demanding money I couldn't give him. I told the court how I had to fight to protect Ethan and myself, how I had no choice but to leave. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. I didn't dare look at David, but I could feel the tension in the room. The judge sat quietly for a moment before dismissing me, and as I walked back to my seat, I felt a sense of release. I had done it. I had told my story. Now, all I could do was wait for the verdict. The waiting was the hardest part. As I sat in the courtroom after giving my testimony, my mind raced. I kept replaying every word I'd said, wondering if it was enough. I had exposed the darkest parts of my life in front of strangers, but it was necessary. I had to protect Ethan, and I had to make sure David faced the consequences of what he had done. Finally, after what felt like hours, the jury returned. My heart pounded in my chest as the judge read the verdict. The courtroom was so silent, you could hear a pin drop. David sat across the room, his face still, but I could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. He had always been good at hiding it in public, but I knew the truth. The judge's voice broke through my thoughts. Guilty. David was found guilty of illegal gambling, fraud, and domestic abuse. A wave of relief washed over me. The judge continued, sentencing David to 8 years in prison. 8 years. It wasn't a lifetime, but it was enough. Enough time for Ethan and me to start over. Enough time for us to heal. David would have no contact with Ethan during his imprisonment, and I was granted full custody. My heart swelled with emotion, a mixture of relief and sadness. Sadness for what we had lost, but also relief that we were free. David didn't react at first. He just sat there, staring ahead, as the reality of his situation sank in. But I didn't focus on him. I had my own future to think about now, my own life to rebuild. As the court proceedings ended, my parents were waiting for me outside. My mother hugged me tightly, and my father, who had remained strong throughout all of this, had tears in his eyes. "It's over," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. "He's gone." "You did it, Isabella," my mother said, holding my hand. "You fought for yourself and for Ethan." In the weeks that followed, life began to take on a new shape. I moved forward with the divorce, and though the legal process took time, I knew it was the right step. Ethan and I stayed with my parents while I found a new place for us. I wanted a fresh start, somewhere that didn't carry the memories of what had happened. I eventually found a small but cozy apartment not far from my parents' house. It wasn't much, but it was ours. A place where Ethan and I could feel safe. Moving into that apartment felt like a new chapter in our lives. The walls were bare, and the rooms felt empty at first, but as we unpacked our things, I began to see it as a home. I decorated Ethan's room with his favorite colors, and we hung up pictures and filled the shelves with his toys and books. His laughter filled the space, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Ethan was doing well, too. Without the tension and fear that had hung over us for so long, he began to flourish. He smiled more, played more, and even made new friends at his school. Watching him thrive made everything I had gone through feel worth it. I also found support in a group for survivors of domestic abuse. Sitting in a room with women who had gone through similar experiences helped me in ways I hadn't expected. We shared our stories, our pain, and our hope. It reminded me that I wasn't alone, that there were others who understood the struggle to rebuild after such darkness. And through those connections, I gained strength. As time passed, I found a new routine. I went back to work as a teacher, a job that I loved, and that gave me the stability I needed to support Ethan. My parents remained close by, always there to help when I needed them. I knew I couldn't have made it through this without them. One day, I received a letter from the district attorney's office. David had tried to appeal his sentence, but it was denied. The justice system had upheld the original verdict. David would serve his full sentence. I sat with the letter in my hands, feeling a sense of closure wash over me. The chapter with David was finally over. But more importantly, I had found peace. I no longer woke up in fear of what the day might bring. I no longer worried about what David might do next. Ethan and I were safe, and that was all that mattered. As I look back on everything that happened, I realize how far we've come. The pain, the fear, the struggle, it's all a part of our story, but it no longer defines us. We've moved forward. I've reclaimed my life, and more importantly, I've created a future where Ethan and I can thrive. The journey wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I'm no longer just a victim. I'm a survivor. And that's something no one can ever take away from me.